Hello and welcome to Fidelity Connects. I'm Pamela Ritchie. The healthcare sector is facing challenges under the U.S. administration's drug pricing reform, and tariffs continue to add some uncertainty. The end-of-month deadline is approaching for drug makers to respond with binding commitments in matching U.S. drug prices to overseas prices. How are equities in healthcare reacting, and what are the implications for pharma more broadly? On a positive note, medical tech seems to be performing well. What opportunities lie there? Happy to say that joining us from the UK to unpack the evolving landscape of the healthcare sector, tariffs, and the investment opportunities is portfolio manager Alex Gold. Alex manages the Fidelity Global Healthcare Fund. Warm welcome to you, Alex, from the UK. How are you today?
Hi, Pamela. I'm good. Thank you very much for having me.
Delighted to have you join us here today. There are many different angles to take a look at this. We see the discussion of drugs everywhere. Is the most important piece, and how is this the most important piece, just watching the U.S. administration at this stage?
Yes, so, as you all know, and any investor knows, that there's been a heightened level of unpredictability since Liberation Day in earlier this year with regards to tariffs, and healthcare is not exempt from that. We are still trying to get clarity on what the tariffs may look like specifically for the healthcare sector and the pharmaceutical companies in particular. And we've had some indications in jurisdictions such as the EU, but there's still areas that are not clear. Perhaps the bigger area of uncertainty, though, is on drug pricing, as you said. And President Trump has brought up a policy called Most Favored Nation, MFN, drug policy that he did look at during his first term. And, in summary, what he's essentially trying to do is say the US will no longer subsidize European drug spending. And the argument, which is not completely unreasonable, is that actually the US spends a lot more on drugs and healthcare than any other country in the world. They spend about 18% of GDP on healthcare. The average across the OECD developed market countries is about 8 to 9%. And the argument of the US administration is a bit like with NATO and defense spending. The US will not keep spending so that every other country in the world can benefit. So he's proposing that US drug prices will come down to the same level as non-US drug prices. And the industry is currently negotiating and responding to some of these demands from the Trump administration. And as you said, by the end of this month, we might get more clarity, or we could continue having a prolonged period of negotiations between the pharma industry and the administration.
So there is a deadline there. It could be expanded a bit, but there's some thought that by the end of the year we might have a bit more clarity on this.
Yes, certainly by the end of this month, we might have some steps towards that. And then we have some drug negotiation pricing in the Medicare channel, which is over 65 elderly population in the US in November, which will be another interesting data point. And I think certainly both the administration as well as the pharmaceutical industry would certainly be keen to get some clarity and resolution by the end of this year. So it's an important overhang to monitor, and at least when we get clarity on what some of the new pricing or some of the mechanisms may be, the investors will then be able to price that and work out which companies are perhaps more impacted than others.
Yeah, and the healthcare sector has been sort of at troughs, and I'll ask you to expand and tell us more about that. One of the big pushbacks for why drugs are so expensive in the US, or why drug companies can charge large amounts, is it's sort of encourages them and incentivizes some of the big companies to spend on innovation and to be creative, to do the research, which is very expensive to do. And it sort of has been cast as the offset that you charge high drug prices because so much money's gone into the front end research. What does that mean as a broad statement, that companies will do innovation less, or is that the risk, one of the risks?
That is absolutely the risk. The companies, the pharmaceutical and large biotech companies will argue that if we cut the pricing in the US to the very low pricing or the much lower pricing in Europe, then that means they will have less R&D dollars to spend and therefore less innovation. And that is the argument that the industry and their lobbyists are putting forward, quite reasonably, I think. But equally, the Trump administration is arguing that why should US taxpayers and households pay more for drugs than anywhere in the world? So, it's going to be quite difficult to make, the UK or European governments, which also have a lot of debt and, some fiscal challenges, pay more for the drugs. But I think certainly there is a willingness by the industry and by the White House to try and readdress the balance somewhat. And we will see how that plays out.
So much of what we talk about today is the industries, the corporations, but it's the geopolitical. You've mentioned the sort of the political overhang here. Just go a little bit further with it in the sense that whatever the drug pricing discussion decision deal is made will probably need to be spun or actually will be a political win on some level for the administration. Presumably they're negotiating with that in mind. Can you just tell us a bit more about what they need?
Yes, I think in the US you have some patients who have large out-of-pocket costs for certain drugs, some patients that don't have access to the drugs because they may be too expensive or they may not have the right coverage. So striking the balance between still driving innovation and allowing companies to develop innovative drugs is really important, and the US is the leader for that. But equally, it needs to be affordable and accessible for the patients as well.
In terms of onshoring, I think there actually have been a number of announcements on onshoring, so bringing drug production either back to the US specifically or just less in China is sort of one big piece of it. I wonder if you can take us into that story a little bit. It's one of the goals, again, to bring production either home or closer to a regional home where things are sold. Has that shifted quite a lot, or are we in the land of announcements where things haven't actually taken place yet?
So you're right, there have been a lot of announcements. I think Eli Lilly, for example, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, said they have committed to 27 billion, I think was the number, of capex investments in the US over a number of years. And most large European and US pharma companies have highlighted specific capex targets in the US over the next 3 to 5 years. We haven't yet seen those the kind of the manufacturing take place yet, because obviously there's a long lead time to actually build a manufacturing plant in the US. But the commitments are there, and I think on a multi-year basis there is the recognition that it's important to manufacture drugs in the country you're selling them. So US manufacturing for US products, China for China, and Europe for Europe. So there's kind of a regionalization of manufacturing which is ongoing, and it will be a multi-year process, but it is underway.
With rhetoric being high, drug pricing being something that's going to be renegotiated here, it sounds like, and some of the other things that you've mentioned, it's priced into the stocks of some of the big pharmaceutical companies, but also the healthcare sector broadly. Tell us where we are in terms of troughs, what we've seen, and I guess what just a little bit of better news might mean once stock prices, the valuation story gets pretty low.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this uncertainty has been there since the Trump administration came into power, and particularly with the new health secretary as well. And there have been heightened concerns, whether it's on academic and government funding like the National Institute of Health, and some of the universities' ability to fund research, as well as this drug pricing reform. And so that's been ongoing now for the majority of this year, and the share prices of the sector increasingly reflect that uncertainty. You can see if you look at the weighting of the healthcare index is just 8.5% of the S&P 500.
Really, the whole healthcare
index.
That's really, really interesting. For the CEOs of some of these big healthcare companies, they will be watching all of these discussions in the policy realm very, very carefully. How much is going to be massively material from some of the points that are being discussed right now? how much is uncertainty that's built into those stocks and the valuations there, and how much is the announcement itself is going to represent something material that drug companies are going to have, a real cut to their bottom line? Is it just the uncertainty cloud?
No, so there could be, obviously the devil will be in the detail, and we don't have that yet, and that's still being negotiated. But one could envisage a scenario where there are certain concessions made by industry on specific parts of drug pricing or rebating, and that might have a 5% impact to earnings, for example. But the removing the overhang of the uncertainty would, with valuations at these levels, would potentially make a lot of the companies more investable to generalists. So that's one scenario. But equally, if the administration tries to be particularly aggressive on drug pricing, which they can really only do in the government channels, because you can't mandate what a commercial payer should pay for a drug. The government cannot legally do that, and they know that, which is why they want some voluntary concessions. Then you could have more impactful reform, but that is seen as at this stage like a lower likelihood, lower probability event. So there could certainly be some impact on earnings, but the valuation multiples do already reflect some of that being likely implemented in the years ahead.
Hello investors, we'll be back to the show in just a moment. I wanted to share that here at Fidelity, we value your opinion. Please take a few minutes to help us shape the future of Fidelity Connect's podcasts. Complete our listener survey by visiting fidelity.ca/survey, and you could win one of our branded tumblers. Periodic draws ending by March 30th, 2026. And don't forget to listen to Fidelity Connects, The Upside, and French Dialogue Fidelity podcasts, available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Now back to today's show.
In Canada, we talk a lot about the sectoral tariffs hitting a number of the natural resource areas as well as the auto industry. I'm not sure in this country if we focused a ton on what the tariff story means for the healthcare sector, but they also, the non-tariff impediments that get discussed quite a lot, or sort of tariffs as punishment for different types of trade issues. Where do the tariffs on the healthcare sector land in the different areas? So we talked a lot about drug pricing and the discussion of the U.S. internal debate, but in terms of tariffs on, even medical devices from other places, how do you sort of add them all up? What kind of impact are they having?
So tariffs are increasingly intertwined with the drug pricing discussion, and the tariffs are actually more impactful for pharmaceuticals rather than medical devices. And the risk really is, if you're a large biopharma company and you produce a lot of drugs, or from a manufacturing perspective, in Europe or Asia, the administration wants you to bring that production to the US. Hence a lot of the capex investments and commitments which we've had. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out, because if you have a 15% tariff on your manufactured goods from Europe into the US, that can be impactful. So I think companies are looking at their supply chains and where they're manufacturing, and I think the result of the tariffs will, as I said, be intertwined with the drug pricing reform and the concessions and the negotiations which are happening concurrently.
It's so interesting to see how much for the industry that you're invested in may have certain things resolved in resolution, and again, that overhang of uncertainty and what that could mean for drug prices. I wonder if we can shift now to ask you it seems to be the most exciting and most talked about area within the drug area, which is the GLP1s for obesity. There's lots of developments there. There's lots of companies that have had turnover because it's almost like an explosion of success, and then they're sort of falling pieces out of that. We've seen CEO turnover and so on. Where does this slightly more mature side of the industry sit right now, if you were to sort of give it a continuum of very nascent to going through? Where are we in the investment cycle for GLP-1s right now?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we're still very early in terms of the number of patients who are actually on these drugs for obesity, because of course GLP-1s are used for diabetic treatment as well, but also increasingly for obesity, which is where the real growth opportunity is, and the percentage of patients on those drugs is still small, in the single million numbers in the US versus about 55 million people that have commercial coverage. So, and an even greater obesity population than that in the US. So we're still very low numbers in terms of penetration. But as you know, the stock market is always forward looking. And at the moment, and it's been evolving over the last 6 months, but at the moment, people think the total obesity revenue opportunity will be about $100 billion. And we're also in a duopoly as things currently stand, with Eli Lilly of the US and Novo Nordisk of Denmark, which is one of the leaders in this field. And so the share price weakness and concerns about their competitive positioning has led to a change of CEO, a change of kind of commercial strategy, and some significant cost-cutting announcements which they've recently made to try and right-size their cost base and infrastructure. But they would argue they still believe there is a significant runway of opportunity for GLP1s versus where we currently are. We are at a very interesting juncture, though, because increasingly the debate is shifting from how big the opportunity is in terms of the addressable market, that 100 billion opportunity for obesity sales by the early 2030s, to what is the pricing of the drug going to look like. Is it sustainable that people still have to pay, let's say, $500 a month for a drug in the US market, whereas in the UK, and President Trump referenced this in one of his press conferences a couple of months ago, but in the UK you can get the drug for about £100 a month. And that's also the reason we recently saw Eli Lilly raise drug prices in the UK for their obesity drug Mounjaro by over 100%. And there's still going to be some rebates. There's not exactly 100% rise, but they are clearly signaling again to the US administration that we will try and put drug prices up in certain markets where it's too low to try and close that gap. So it's continuing to evolve. The long-term pricing is kind of a key question mark at the moment, to see how quickly that opportunity of that 100 billion is realized and whether that is indeed the right number.
A curious and sort of fascinating comparison that I was thinking of when you and I spoke off air a little while ago was when everyone wants the same handbag and they're very, very, very expensive, it fuels a knockoff market. And that's happened with the GLP-1s. Tell us about that.
Yes, so the compounding has been a real issue, the kind of the knockoff products. And under FDA rules, companies are allowed to give a compounded, cheaper version of the patented branded drug when there is a shortage. And we have had shortages last year because of the supply-demand imbalance for these obesity drugs. However, in the last 6 months or so, that has been resolved, and the compounded products, which are supplying about 1.5 million people with cheaper obesity drugs on the market, are still available. And so this is something which Novo Nordisk is fighting from a legal and regulatory perspective and trying to ensure that the FDA helps enforce. But it is having a significant impact on their ability to grow sales and volumes as fast as they expected. And it's also having, I think, an impact on the price that people are willing to pay when they have recently had an experience of having the cheaper compounded version. So that is a dynamic which is really quite unique to this drug class, which we haven't had before, and it has had a significant impact. So we'll see how that is resolved. But what it also does is it highlights things. One, the kind of some of the price sensitivity around the drugs, but also the volume demand, the fact that people really want these drugs, they're paying out of pocket for them.
So patents end at certain times for all drugs, and when is the patent up for, in terms of generics can come in and start making these drugs to maybe take some pressure off the compounding situation? But when does that uptake begin?
So Novo Nordisk's semaglutide drug is up for genericization in 2031, and that's really important because their next generation product, a product called CagriSema, had recent results in December, which showed that the efficacy was not, the weight loss was not quite as high as people have been hoping for. People have been hoping for 25% weight loss, and it was more in the sort of the low 20s. And so the concern for Novo Nordisk in particular is that actually, if your next generation product isn't differentiated enough, and that is also a risk, I think, for Eli Lilly, who do have follow-on drugs and potentially more potent ones coming down the line. But if a good drug with 17-18% weight loss becomes generic in 2031, then this is a big question mark what that would do to the whole drug class, both in terms of volumes and the price that people are willing to pay. So that's going to be a really interesting case in point. And actually, we have a couple of case studies coming up soon, not in markets like the US, but in Brazil and indeed Canada. The drug is going off patent in 2026. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in those markets.
And when you mentioned that they have a drug loss product that will have you lose maybe not 25% of your weight, but more in the teens, might that be okay for some people? I mean, does everyone? It'll be interesting to measure how everyone wants 25% drug loss, and maybe a smaller amount would be okay or not. You don't know yet.
Yeah, no, that's the ongoing debate at the moment. I think increasingly people want good tolerability. You don't want to have sort of diarrhea, nausea, excess vomiting, and you want to lose a certain amount of weight. I think 25% is a lot of weight loss that the majority of people don't need to lose that much. So teens weight loss is probably fine. And indeed, this is something which could be an opportunity for Eli Lilly, for example. They have an oral obesity pill called orforglipron, where they recently had data in phase 3, and they hope the product will be launched in 2026.
Because most of them are injectables, are they? Most of them at this point are injectables.
The others, yes, the others are injectables. So now their pill is a daily pill where you could lose about, the clinical trial showed 10.8% of your weight. And so there's a debate in the market now about, okay, so that's a lot less than the injectable of high teens, but a lot of people might just prefer to take the pill and be happy with 11% weight loss. So, again, it's another mechanism of action, another sort of way to segment and fragment the market. And it will be interesting to see, what proportion of people want that option. But that will likely be available, probably in 2026.
One way or the other, it looks like prices can stay high because demand is there.
Well, that is the big debate. It's not clear because the compounding has shown that there is price sensitivity, and Novo Nordisk, from a competitive perspective, has to start fighting and taking back market share. So that is the big question mark: is what will happen to pricing in the next couple of years.
Interesting. Canada will be a case study for the generic uptake of that. We'll report back to you. You'll tell us what's happening here. We'll tell you our stories. A further patent story is, there seems to be a patent cliff every sort of 7 or 8 years or whatever it is. There's one coming up for a lot of drug makers. How that usually spurs some version of M&A. Is that what you see coming over the next few years as well?
Yes, so the second half of the 2020s, which we're now entering, is there is a litany of large drugs going off patent, and we can see that likes of Bristol Myers, Merck, J&J, Pfizer. A lot of the large companies have big drugs going off patent. Some companies have a pipeline that will replenish that shortfall of revenues. Other companies have been busy doing M&A already over the last 5 years to try and offset that, and probably still have more M&A to do. And that M&A can be a combination of small bolt-on M&A, $1 or $2 billion type companies where they're buying a phase 2 asset which they hope will materialize and bolster their pipeline. Or companies can spend a lot more than that and buy almost ready-made products which they can slot into their sales infrastructure and hopefully in the latter half of this decade, contribute $2 billion of sales to help offset the patents, which are going off patent. So that's kind of part of being a drug company. You're having to spend a lot of money on R&D. You're having to do M&A to help replenish the pipeline. But there is quite a few holes to still fill over the next few years for some of these companies, and some are better positioned than others.
And I remember you've said in the past the fund actually does not invest in sort of the biotechs, but I guess if the big drug companies sort of buy them up because they're trying to make sure they're on the right track to have enough patents in the pipeline, that's a different story. Tell us a bit more about how you invest in other segments of the healthcare sector. We know actually medical tech is still doing quite well, and that's the knee replacement story, or tell us more about that?
Yeah, so medical devices is an area where the fund has a significant overweight and a lot of exposure, and it's an area which is really interesting because historically it's always been recession-proof. It's been sort of resilient to a lot of the kind of political noise which you have on regulation and reform, and you've got a lot of good companies that kind of give good compounded sales growth of 7, 8, 9%, a bit of operating leverage on the margin side, and then have a good track record of capital allocation, of buying small new products to sell on their sales infrastructure and continue to accelerate that growth. So there's been a lot of good examples of companies that have compounded sort of in the low teens from an earnings and free cash flow perspective, and it's companies that do things like hip and knee implants, companies that sell pacemakers or heart valve replacement products. And there are some really good innovative products which, for example, can be more minimally invasive, which is better for the patient. It's cheaper for the hospital because you don't need to recover for as long, and they ultimately have better outcomes as well. So companies like Boston Scientific, Stryker, Intuitive Surgical, there are a lot of really good medical device companies that are doing well, particularly after the COVID hiatus where people weren't allowed to have a lot of these treatments in hospital because hospitals were obviously full. So it's an area with really robust fundamentals, sort of recession resilience, and a lack of regulatory pressures.
It sounds like such a fascinating area, and these companies, some things they do with robotics is like from outer space. It's incredible. So you invest in some of those. The drugs makers themselves, the pharma companies, you're sort of at the ready if it comes along. Tell us just a tiny bit more about positioning as we close out here.
Yeah, so I'm selective on my exposure to the pharmaceutical companies. You can either have those which have a lack of patents expiring and have good growth prospects, as well as some companies that the entire pipeline of what they're developing is valued at nothing, and that can be an opportunity where you get free optionality if something comes through there as well. So I think you have to be selective in an idiosyncratic sector within pharma. And then the other area, kind of as part of the supply chain, there is the life science and tool sector. This is the sector that historically I would characterize as the pick and shovels manufacturers in the gold rush, and there's some really good companies there that help manufacture drugs, help run the clinical trials, help sell the analytical instrumentation which is used for research, but those companies have been under pressure because as there's been uncertainty in China, as there's been uncertainty with academic government funding, there's been uncertainty with pharma drug pricing policy and reform, that's led to a slowdown in growth and demand for those companies. But in my view, that is transitory. That is not a structural shift. So I think there are some interesting opportunities within that cohort of life science and tools companies as well.
It's absolutely fascinating. Alex, thank you. What would you just leave with investors as sort of, the next medium to long-term opportunity here, again, as the healthcare sector perhaps gets up off the floor a bit and maybe has pretty interesting valuations to take a look at?
Yeah, I'd just say there's a lot of risks and uncertainty in healthcare at the moment. I think that's largely reflected in the valuations and the performance of the sector, but it's one of the most innovative, important sectors in the market, and we still have an aging population, whether that's in the US, Canada, anywhere in the Western world. So the demand for healthcare is not changing in what is one of the most innovative sectors in the world. So there's plenty of opportunity to find good ideas at these levels.
Alex Gold, thank you so much for joining us to inform us this fascinating area that you are investing in and the opportunities therein. Have a great weekend.
Thanks for watching or listening to the Fidelity Connects podcast. Now, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Fidelity Connects on your podcast platform of choice. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave a review or a 5-star rating. Fidelity mutual funds and ETFs are available by working with a financial advisor or through an online brokerage account. Visit fidelity.ca/howtobuy for more information. While on fidelity.ca, you can also find more information on future live webcasts. And don't forget to follow Fidelity Canada on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Instagram. We'll end today's show with a short disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Fidelity Investments Canada ULC or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment, tax, or legal advice. It is not an offer to sell or buy, or an endorsement, recommendation, or sponsorship of any entity or securities cited. Read a fund's prospectus before investing. Funds are not guaranteed. Their values change frequently and past performance may not be repeated. Fees, expenses, and commissions are all associated with fund investments. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.